Getting older is something that no one, except children, wants to do, but everybody does. It is such a common feature of our humanity that the subject of age has generated more wisdom and humor than almost any other. Ogden Nash has said, "Middle age is when you have met so many people that every new person you meet reminds you of someone else." A comedian told about going to the Mayo Clinic for a physical examination at the age of 49. When he asked the doctor for his opinion of his physical condition, the medic replied, "Oh, everything is normal. If you died tomorrow, no one would be surprised." Regardless of how we approach old age, fighting it, joking about it, or trying not to think about it, it is inevitable. We begin to age from the point of conception onward. Our physical development peaks in adolescence and reaches maturity at the age of 25 to 35. These are the years when most athletes are at their peak. Shortly thereafter, we begin to decline. If a normal lifespan is 70 years, then middle age is not 50, as we frequently speak of it, it is 35. The period of physical decline is frequently referred to as senescence, the downhill part of life, from the point of maximal functioning until death. As we get further along in the process of senescence, life usually becomes more difficult, and depending on our circumstances, less enjoyable. In Ecclesiastes chapter 11, verse 7 through chapter 12, verse 8, Solomon talks about youth and the days beyond youth. Light is sweet, and it pleases the eyes to see the sun. However many years a man may live, let him enjoy them all, but let him remember the days of darkness, for they will be many. Everything to come is meaningless. Verse 7 says, "The light is sweet. It pleases the eyes to see the sun." Solomon says life is to be enjoyed, not endured. Now, this proverb of the light being sweet may seem a bit meaningless until we observe the usual meaning of the Old Testament symbolism of light. This word frequently stands for the goodness and joy of life. Michael A. Eaton observed, "The goodness of life is portrayed by light, which, as elsewhere in the Old Testament, is used to denote joy, blessing, and life, in contrast to sorrow, adversity, and death. It is being joyfully alive." Solomon also proclaims that in spite of its vanity or meaninglessness, life has its good aspects, and it is good to enjoy them. Life is beautiful and worthy of being cared for and enjoyed. It is the spirit of the whole book, that is Ecclesiastes, that along with the call to earnest activity, there should be the call to the pleasant enjoyment of life. He who faithfully labors has a right to enjoy his life. But someone might wonder, why do we need to be told that? The answer is that some of life's vanities often cause us to think that we are not supposed to enjoy life. Maybe you grew up around unhappy, negative thinking people who gave you the impression that life is not supposed to be enjoyed. An enormous load of guilt feelings is passed from their parents, teachers, and others of importance to them that causes them to feel they are unworthy of a happy life. They may think that something is wrong if they are not sad or struggling with a deep problem. Well, Solomon and God says, wrong. Christians are not supposed to spend their lives with a dismal outlook. God wants his people to be joyful and appreciative of his blessings. If anyone is to look for the bright side in this world, it must be the people of God, those who can look beyond circumstances and see life's real meaning and the true beauty which is found in a knowledge of its Creator. According to the opening chapters of Genesis, Satan, not God, injected the element of vanity into life under the sun. Satan wants to eradicate God's joy from our lives, but God wants to eradicate the vanity and fill us with joy. Despite the inevitable vanity, much is good about life, and it is all right to enjoy life. Solomon also says every phase of life is to be enjoyed. There is, or can be, something good about life at every stage. We notice the first part of verse 8, however many years a man may live, let him enjoy them all. We may at times have to look for the good, but it is there for the finding. Obviously, it is easier to find the good at sometimes in life than others. Youth is generally a time of optimism and strength, but changes come, and that in itself can be depressing. It is not enjoyable to see your skin sag, your eyes grow dim, your strength diminish, or your hair staring back at you from the bathroom sink. But Solomon advises us not to spend our lives bemoaning the changes. Rather, we should look for the unique joys that come with each phase of life. Solomon gives an interesting and sobering reason for what he says about enjoying all of life's phases. The latter part of verse 8, let him remember the days of darkness, for they will be many. This is merely a poetic way of saying, you had better enjoy life now. You will be dead for a very long time. The certainty of death makes it imperative to enjoy life while we can. Many people die years before their time by refusing to look for the good in life and by making themselves miserable. Of course, we know something about death that Solomon did not know, that it can be even better than earthly life because of Christ. Even for Christians, our time in this life is limited, and we should use it to the fullest. The psalmist said, teach us to number our days aright, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. And Jesus said, as long as it is day, we must do the work of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. Solomon says youth is not to be wasted. In verse 9, he says, be happy, young man, while you are young, and let your heart give you joy in the days of your youth. Solomon seems to advise against the tendency to feel sorry for ourselves and create our own brand of misery. Youth is the time to learn that life is, to a great extent, what you choose to make it. So much of the way our lives turn out depends on our outlook. A popular saying is, have a good day. It is a pleasant sentiment, but it does not mean much. A better exhortation would be, make it a good day. We must take the initiative in molding and using our circumstances, good and bad, to the fullest. Solomon advises the young man to banish anxiety from your heart and cast off the troubles of your body, verse 10. Now, no one can remove all pain and frustration from life, but we should remove all we can and not make ourselves miserable. For youth and vigor are meaningless or fleeting, Solomon says. Neither youth nor the prime of life are permanent, and neither holds the ultimate answer to life's meaning. Enjoy your youth, Solomon says, and do not waste it, but realize there is more to life than its first 20 or 30 years. Solomon says we are morally and spiritually responsible for the way we live. The first part of verse 9 could be misunderstood as teaching that we should do just what we want to do, just as we please. Be happy, young man, while you're young, and let your heart give you joy in the days of your youth. Follow the ways of your heart and whatever your eyes see. But the last statement provides a necessary corrective to that idea. but know that for all these things God will bring you to judgment. These words are intended to provide a balanced view of life. Life is to be enjoyed, but limits are to be observed. God will call us to account for all we do. This balanced understanding will save us from misusing our lives. Many of the problems plaguing today's youth are tragic, for they are unnecessary and avoidable. Alcohol and drug abuse, teen pregnancy, the danger of AIDS, other things all complicate life needlessly. Life has enough vanity or meaninglessness without making it worse. Solomon is not just talking about the natural consequences of sin. We must face God in judgment and answer for the lives we have lived. Now, Solomon has no clear conception of what this judgment will be like, but his faith in a moral God makes it certainty. All that we do, whether in youth or old age, is done in God's sight, and we must answer for it. Solomon says youth should realize that they should remember God now. As we come to chapter 12, remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the days of trouble come, and the years approach when you will say, I find no pleasure in them. The decline in both physical and mental vigor is what Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verses 1 through 8 is talking about. In the first verse, Solomon admonishes the young to remember God before the days of trouble come. Another translation, before the evil days come. By evil days, Solomon does not refer to moral evil. He means the difficult days, the days of trouble. These are the years of old age, years in which many find no pleasure. If we do not respond to God before the period of our youth, during this period of our youth, Solomon warns we may never do so. Therefore, he advises to remember God now. Charles Swindoll adds that if we fail to remember God in youth, our investment in evil rather than good will pay dreadful dividends. It will lead to scars, heartaches, and regrets that we will carry into our old age. This sorrow and guilt will steal our peace and joy, not only now, but also in the years to come. As he points out, the aging process is difficult enough without adding the detrimental effects of an ungodly lifestyle. Solomon next gives a series of figurative descriptions of the aging process, in verses 2 through 5. Before the sun and the light, and the moon and the stars grow dark, and the clouds return after the rain, when the keepers of the house tremble and the strong men stoop, when grinders cease because they are few, and those looking through the windows grow dim, when the doors of the street are closed, and the sound of grinding fades, when men rise up at the sound of birds, but all their songs grow faint, when men are afraid of heights and of dangers in the streets, when the almond tree blossoms, and the grasshopper drags himself along, and desire no longer is stirred, then man goes to his eternal home, and mourners go about the streets. Verse 2 describes the fading joys of life in terms of a gathering storm. The clouds return after the rain. Sorrows just keep coming. Verses 3 and 4 may, on the one hand, employ the figure of a once busy estate now fallen into decay and despair. Or some commentators believe we have here a metaphorical description of what it is to get old. The keepers of the house would represent the arms and hands. They're not what they used to be. Grinders could be teeth. There are less of them. The windows grow dim. Might refer to the eyes, to the eyesight. The doors could be the mouth or possibly even the loss of hearing. Verse 5 describes some of the consequences of old age. The almond tree blossoms are white, suggesting the graying of one's hair. The grasshopper which once flitted about easily now drags along. That sounds like when we get older, doesn't it? And desire is no longer stirred. Following these vignettes comes a series of images describing death. Then man goes to his eternal home, while mourners go about the streets. Life is portrayed as a golden bow suspended by a silver cord. Eventually the cord snaps and the bow is smashed. Likewise, the end of life may be thought of as a pitcher which becomes broken at the well, whereas the broken wheel by which the water jar is raised and lowered into the well. And finally, Solomon says, the dust returns to the ground it came from, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. Then comes Solomon's refrain. Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher. Everything is meaningless. Well, that statement seems especially appropriate here. All of this description amounts to a depressing one of the aging process and the sadness of death. But Solomon's purpose is not to depress us, but to rouse us to action. Remembering God does not mean simply to think about him, but to allow the knowledge of him to shape our lives before old age sets in. Why should we remember God before old age comes? Why not worry about such matters later in life? Solomon gives several reasons. First, we owe God the strength of our youth. Solomon reminds us individually that God is our creator and that the spirit returns to God who gave it. Robert Davidson paraphrases, celebrate life, but remember you only have it on temporary loan. Don't pretend that you are self-made or self-sufficient. You have a creator. If we fail to use our lives to serve God, we are stealing from him. As Israel gave God the first fruits of their produce and livestock, we are to give God the first fruits of life itself, not the leftovers. If you have been thinking that you will serve God later, realize that later is not what he demands. He wants you to serve him now with your total being. We remember these words of Solomon in that he says, remembering God in our youth will keep old age from being worse than it has to be. Youth is a crucial period in determining the course of the rest of one's life. Habits, both good and bad, are formed in youth. The early years contain numerous pitfalls, many of which can affect us for the rest of our life. Doing God's will can save us from making these tragic mistakes. Besides, most people who deliberately wait to remember God never remember God. If he is unimportant to one in his youth, it is unlikely that he will be later. There are exceptions, but the general rule is that the longer you wait to obey God, the less likely it is you will ever do so. Eventually, if we wait until the time of life described in the first verses of chapter 12, we may even be mentally unable to change. Waiting is dangerous. Why deprive ourselves of the joy for which we were created, to know God and have the peace and security of his presence for all eternity? Solomon seems to be saying, turn to God before you reach a joyless point in life. Real joy comes from living in communion with God. As Swindle points out, God has designed us to be empty without him. Old age can be a time of peaceful satisfaction or of deep regret. My friend Tommy South has helped me in understanding Ecclesiastes. He gets a good deal of credit for these sermons. But he told of two elderly sisters that he used to visit. One had lived a godly life for many years, At age 94, she was one of the most delightful people he had ever met. In spite of old age, physical adversity, and the loss of her husband of over 60 years, she remained cheerful, sweet-tempered, interested in others, and optimistic about going to be with her Lord. Her sister, on the other hand, had refused to give her life to the Lord. She lived her own way, knowing that she was doing wrong, and came to old age sick and disabled. On Tommy's frequent visits to her in the hospital, she would almost always cry, shedding tears over a life misspent and uncertain that God could forgive her. Her last years were dominated by sadness, depression, and the inability to think of anything but her troubles. The evil days, the troublesome days, had come with a vengeance because she had failed to heed Solomon's advice. Howard Hughes was an enormously successful businessman, aircraft manufacturer, movie producer, and companion of the stars in Hollywood. But there was no room for God in his crowded life. In his later years, he became neurotic about his health, unable to trust anyone, addicted to narcotics, a recluse who spent his days, in spite of his millions, sitting unclothed in a darkened room. When he died, there was a tremendous scramble for the remains of his vast estate. The evil days came for him too, and he was unprepared because he had not remembered God. We should remember our Creator in the days of our youth because the inevitable conclusion of life is death. In one sobering image of death, Solomon says that man goes to his eternal home. The going is expressed by a Hebrew participle, which shows that it is a process, a continuous act of dissolution. In other words, we are on our way to our eternal home right now. Solomon admonishes us to remember God before life's finale, because you can do nothing to stop or forestall it. There isn't a guarantee that we will even live to see old age. Now, some of us are there or very close. But there's been many a young person who never saw their 40th birthday or their 50th birthday. We don't have a guarantee about tomorrow. The New Testament encourages us to be ready at all times to meet God. The writer of Hebrews says it is appointed for men to die once, and after this comes judgment. And Paul says to the Corinthians, "For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that each one may be recompensed for his deeds in the body." How our lives end and how we spend eternity is up to each one of us. Jesus came in order to give us a choice between a full life, that is eternal life, and a life devoid of spiritual blessings. C.S. Lewis says, there are only two kinds of people in the end: those who say to God, "Thy will be done," and those to whom God says, in the end, "Thy will be done." All that are in hell choose it. Without that self-choice, there could be no hell. No soul that seriously and constantly desires joy will ever miss it. Those who seek find. To those who knock, it is opened. The problem that too many of us have is expressed by Paul Earnhardt. He says, "We have watched enough people who burn the candle at both ends and offer God the smoke." If we are ever going to remember God in our youth, that means we must do it now. We are as young today as we will ever be. We're not getting any younger, as we often say. The days of trouble, of old age, are coming to us. They may already be here. If we've been waiting to serve God, it is past time to start. We must not delay. We must choose for ourselves, as Solomon instructs, joy, both now and in eternity.